Hey, welcome to this Q&A video. Sorry it's been a while. I asked these questions on Blue Sky a long time ago, so I apologise that it's taken me this long to do it. I previously made a video sort of explaining everything I had to go through sort of lately, so that would have gone into more than I'm willing to get into right now. Anyway, you're here for the Q&A, so let's get into it. How can someone who knows nothing about audio technicalities compare between devices, e.g. car stereo, to know what's best? I feel a lot of specs have buzzwords for us noob. Side question, what's the most common spec to fall for as a noob? Now, the audio industry, quite frankly, sucks. There's a lot of really stupid practices that exist within the audio industry. One of them is PMPO, and I'll get into that in a minute. The other one's frequency response. Half the time it's misquoted, or it's quoted at like such a small volume so that you literally wouldn't be able to hear the frequencies. Like some speakers will claim they go down to like 60 hertz or less than that, but then it'll be at like minus 39 dB. Now minus 39 dB might as well be a whisper, honestly. You genuinely wouldn't hear it, especially over the rest of the music. Your best bet is to stick to RMS. RMS, or root mean square, is like the actual, think of it as like the actual power the speaker puts out and what it can put out consistently. PMPO is actually not even an industry standard. PMPO is a standard that was basically, source, I made it up. It can literally be the amount of power a speaker can consume for like a millisecond, and I'm not even joking. They'll actually test amplifiers or speakers to that rating. It might only be a millisecond and it may explode, and if it doesn't explode, the amount of distortion you're going to hear it's just going to sound like bit crunched crap. Like, you're not going to be able to hear anything coming out of that speaker or amplifier. So anything that says PMPO, ignore it. When these are advertised on eBay, sometimes you'll see like 300 watts and you're like, wow, that's a lot of power. Like, it's wrong. It's literally a lie. Because if you look into the RMS values, it's normally like 20, 30 watt, which is great if you've got like a, say, a stereo from the early 80s or the late 70s or even the 60s or something like that, and you just want something that works. Go for something like that. In fact, one of the most important things, I would say, even above wattage, especially if you've got like a stock stereo and you just want to experiment a little bit, look at speaker sensitivity, honestly. Like somewhere in the range of like 87 onwards. I'd say 87 is probably the comfortable minimum, because any lower than 87, the speaker's not that sensitive anymore. So what the sensitivity is that 87 decibels I just mentioned to you is what the speaker is basically capable of if you were to put 1 watt of power through it and you were to sit 1 meter away. There would be 87 dB of sound. Like, you'd hear 87 decibels of music at 1 meter away at 1 watt. So if you put that into perspective, I mean, most car stereos from sort of the 70s to the 80s, a lot of them were sort of 1-2 watt RMS amplifiers. So something that can do 87 dB at 1 meter away, that's pretty good. Granted, they don't always factor in total harmonic distortion, so there might be a little bit of distortion at that. Use that as a sort of baseline reference for whatever speaker you're buying, whether it's Pioneer, whether it's JBL, whatever you like. If you use the speaker sensitivity as a reference, that basically shows you how loud you're going to be able to get it with 1 watt. So if you've got a 40 watt RMS setup, that's going to get pretty loud. If it's 87 dB at 1 watt, you're already approaching near hearing damage levels of sound at like almost nothing of the RMS of the actual speaker rating. So sensitivity is like fantastic. I almost consider it a hack, honestly, for especially a lot of old factory systems. Another thing to bear in mind is speaker impedance. Basically, you want to try and match what your car stereo can do. Now, 99% of what you're going to come across is going to be 4 ohms. So if the speaker says it's 4 ohms, great, it's probably going to be compatible with your system. But if you've got a high-end car and it's got like, 6 speaker array with a twin amplifier setup or whatever, you might want 8 ohms. Your best way to know is to look into forums, see if anyone's mentioned what your car has. There's a good chance if you look in the forum, someone will be like, oh yes, it takes 8 ohm speakers at this position. Believe me, it doesn't matter how obscure your car is, someone's probably posted about a speaker upgrade for your car. It's fantastic. So that's just something to watch out for. Now you might say, can I mix and match them? You can in one direction, but it's not recommended. And then in the other direction, it's like, just don't do it, it's not safe. Let me explain. So if you were to use a 4-ohm speaker in your car that you know has an 8-ohm amplifier, it'll actually provide too much of a load for that amplifier. Because the resistance of that speaker is so low, it's able to draw loads and loads of power. Think about like sort of basic circuitry. A resistor is a device that can limit the amount of current going to something, and thus less power goes through it. So if your speaker's a lower ohm, if your speaker has lower impedance, think of it as a lower resistance resistor, essentially. The less there is, the more current that can pass through it, and the exact same principle is with speakers. But the problem is with amplifiers, if you were to put a 4-ohm speaker in an 8-ohm system, it can actually draw more power than the amplifier is rated for, and it can really make it run hot. So then you might ask, what about an 8-ohm speaker on a 4-ohm system? Now you can do that, and nothing bad happens. You're not going to break anything, you're not going to break the speaker, you're not going to break the amplifier, but it's just not going to sound very good, because the amplifier is going to struggle to properly put all of the information from your music into that speaker. So it can end up sounding a bit thin, a bit dull, a bit quiet, especially quiet. It's something you'll notice if anybody here is into like headphones, for example. If you don't impedance match between the device you plug into something, it can sound either dull or blow your head off. Like, you know, it can go either way. That's sort of my basics. I hope that wasn't too jargony. The annoying thing about audio is it's very difficult to convey things. If I want to give you the TLDR, read forums. So check your speaker impedance, the ohms, or this little symbol here. Check your speaker sensitivity, make sure it's at least 87. Anything higher than 87, great, you're going to get even more out of that 1 watt. But 87's like probably about as low as I'd want to go ideally. Obviously wattage, for most factory systems, most of them at best, especially if we're talking sort of 80s to 90s, maybe 20 watts RMS. The majority is sort of 15 and below. So if you stick to sort of speakers around the sort of 20 watt RMS range, or even sort of 45 watt RMS range, it'll probably be fine. Your best bet is to experiment. And the best way I can say to do that is start out cheap. You know, don't buy the really expensive speaker system right away. Especially if you've got an old car where you've really got to take into considerations like how deep is the magnet in case it hits your door window, or in case it doesn't fit in the cabinet, or if it's too heavy for where you're going to mount it, you know, stuff like that. Luckily, most manufacturers post specs on their websites so you can get the full sort of dimensions and whatnot. And I always say, in order to measure what you're going to put into your car, sort of measure between where the speaker basket sits against the sort of door or cabinet, and then how much depth from there you have in there. Because sometimes the factory speakers, because you might say why not measure them, but sometimes they're actually slightly shallower than you might actually be able to fit. Essentially measure what you got. That's really important. So speaker sensitivity, don't pick a crazy wattage if you're sticking with a stock setup, and speaker impedance. They're your main things to look out for. Oh, and ignore PMPO. If you're ever worried about a wattage rating, you're like, is this true? Especially if it says something crazy like 100 watt, 300 watt, check the specs. Look for that RMS value. If they ever say peak music output power or peak power or like max power or something, ignore that. You want RMS because RMS is what it can actually do continuously. So the end of this is basically do your research. And that's not to sound bad to anybody, it's just knowledge is power, especially when you're dealing with an industry that loves to just essentially prop itself up with lies and half-truths. As long as you research basically everything I've said, you'll probably buy a good set of speakers, you know. That's what I go by, you know, like I say, input sensitivity, wattage, impedance. If you research all of those things and make sure you can basically match it to your current setup, you know, whatever it says in your handbook, service manual, forums, if you can match it to any of that, well done. You're probably going to get a fantastic speaker setup. And if you want more of that like crazy bass, then just add a subwoofer. I mean, you can even add like under-seat subwoofers these days. And I have considered that in one aspect, and that's when a car has very small speakers. Now, I'm not one of those people who wants the great big, you know, blasting sub in the boot of their car. I'm all about those under-seat subwoofers because you literally won't be able to see them. Granted, you might lose foot space under the seat or storage space, but they can be a really good solution if you just want a little bit more of a punch without the car looking like you've messed about with it. You might even be able to hide an under-seat subwoofer somewhere in the boot. I thought about that at one point, sort of mounting it somewhere sort of hidden in there so you couldn't even see it. Research is fantastic. I mean, while I was researching for this video, I learned a few things. You know, the audio industry is crazy. I don't think I fully understand it. I just have a grasp on sort of what's good and what's bad, and I guess maybe that's a sort of general consumer grasp. I think sometimes a lot of people may think I'm like an expert in audio, and I'm absolutely not. Jesus Christ, there's a reason that that's an engineering like job. There's a reason that audio engineer is a real job, and it's a real job that involves maths that I am incredibly underqualified to have as a functional skills haver. There's physics involved in that, and while I find that stuff interesting, it does not stay in the noggin. So all the things I've told you though are valid, but there's a lot of nuance and stuff like that. It doesn't really matter for the average consumer, but if you're like into audio, then just do your research, because this video is like surface level. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because, you know, some audiophiles are like, oh, you know, I measure the exact amount of excursion that my speaker does when there's, you know, huge amounts of bass or whatever. Just enjoy your music. Just pick a set of speakers that matches everything I've told you, and that you like the sound of. And if you like the sound of them, congratulations, you've got the best audio setup for you. Because at the end of the day, audio is like hugely subjective. An audio system that I like, you might think, God, that's terrible, you know? And vice versa. There might be an audio system that you like that I might think, oh, that's not for me at all. But that's the great thing about most hobbies, you know? They can be whatever the hell you want them to be, you know? It's like art, and music is art in a way, so the best way that you like to listen to music is the most valid way to listen to music, and I think a lot of people forget that. Personal preference, super important in this hobby, so the next time you tell someone that their audio choice is wrong, take a little think about it. If they're happy with it, leave them alone. Comparison, after all, is the thief of joy. What's your holy grail of car audio, and why is it the Panasonic CQ TX5500D? Now this stereo is crazy. It's a double din JDM only stereo that has a great big valve in the middle, and I believe it's a real valve amplifier as well from what I've seen. And they look amazing, you know, with that brushed silver. They look like a proper premium piece of equipment. But have you seen the prices of these things? Christ, some of them cost as much as the cars I've had. So while they're absolutely gorgeous, I don't think I'm ever going to have one, but they are amazing. But speaking of things I'm never going to have that's actually my holy grail, I would say the Philips 22 DC085. Now, if you don't know what the 22 DC085 is, it's one of the first ever car stereos to feature a CD player. And it's a very cool piece of industrial Philips design. It's based on the chassis that they often put the very, you know, not very well made tape decks into, unfortunately. But as far as I'm aware, the CD player is pretty good. I think it tends to suffer a bit with capacitors in this day and age, but I mean, what electronic device doesn't half the time? But that's probably my holy grail, just because it would be super cool to have one, because they are super rare, because they were eye-wateringly expensive when they were new. Because don't forget, this was like sort of early to mid 80s, and the CD came out in, what was it, 81, 82? So it had been a mere few years since the compact disc landed, you know, and everybody enjoyed that Dire Straits Money for Nothing demonstration with it, which does sound amazing on CD, by the way. But yeah, that would be my holy grail, especially because it's that classic Philips design, as I say, without the P6 Philips cassette deck mechanism in, because anybody who knows me and follows my stuff all around, and I've probably mentioned it in the video before, the P6 mechanism sucks. Not because it necessarily performs badly, but because it's just so badly made. So no matter how well it performs, it basically has a shelf life for those stupid flywheels and whatever. But yeah, thank you both for that question. I can't remember if I thanked you for the last question. Both amazing questions, and really made me think about this when I was writing the video. How and why did you learn to tinker with radios and electronics in general? Also, Chloe and Sammy Repair Shop sounds nice and feasible as a business in my opinion. Well, my desire to get into electronics mostly stems from my dad. He used to be in the trade as an auto electrician and a general mechanic, so basically lived and breathed electronics for a decent amount of time, which is funny because he's someone for the most part that generally hates technology, and admittedly in this day and age he's probably pretty forward thinking on that, honestly. A lot of it comes from my dad, and my dad's kind of struggled to keep employment up until pretty recently, really. For a while, he co-ran a business, a Fiat and Alfa Romeo specialist as it happens, and it was successful for a little while, but by the sort of 2010s it really started to struggle. So as I was sort of leaving secondary school and going into college in the sort of mid to late 2010s, we fell into poverty pretty hard. As a result, and even when I was a kid, as when it was sort of starting to see the cracks in the wall, I kind of learned the make, do, and mend, because a lot of the time, if I had something, it might have been the only thing I could ever have for like years and years and years. It doesn't matter if it cost £1 or £200. That was a lot of money to us. It didn't matter which one was which, because if we kept spending that amount of money again, we might not be able to put the heating on at night or be able to feed ourselves. And genuinely, we actually went through that level of poverty at one point when my dad was in and out of employment. But he had a job in between that business failing where he worked for another garage. And let's just say the owner wasn't particularly nice to him and would kind of pay him whenever he felt like it. So we really barely had any money during that time period. And that was sort of when I started at college, and in reality, that didn't really stop until about 2020 when my dad finally left that place and basically found the job he has now. Hopefully that sort of puts into perspective the kind of life I had to grow up with. In fact, a lot of the time I was making money by just finding like scrap laptops in bins and sort of fixing them up, or like scrap radios or that sort of thing, and then fixing them up and selling them on. I paid off many a debt doing that, and it was a crazy time to be in, put it that way. And that's where my love for electronics came from. Because in order to get, some high-end electronics, I might have had to buy it off eBay as spares or repairs, or go digging through like a bin or a skip or something like that. That was sometimes the only way I could get something. So I had to get pretty good at repairing things. And don't get me wrong, I am not an expert at repairing things. I'm still not. I mean, next door in my radio room, there's still a bunch of radios sat on the shelf that I have no clue how to fix, because I am not, a massive expert. But I do what I can. And I'm one of those people who's managed to sort of spot an easy fix in something. So, like, someone could present to me something in bits, and as long as every screw and every piece was in there, usually I can get it back together and get it working again. And that's just because it's all the time I had in the world. When I was living at home, I couldn't get a job. I tried really hard to get a job. I couldn't get one. Obviously, my parents didn't have a lot of money. I couldn't ask them for money. So the only hobby I had was electronics, because I was stuck in my room all day. I needed to pay rent. I needed to keep bailiffs and stuff off of our back. So I just learned to fix things, and just like there is now, there was a lot of failures back then, and it sucked because any failure back then was a lot of money. But eventually I was sort of able to snowball it a little bit. I think I made about £2,000 in total. So it's not like it's not something you can live off of, because this was over the course of a few years I made £2,000. It's tough, trying to live off of stuff you find in the scrap and fixing it up. The scrapper life, as they call it, or whatever. But it got us through, and that's sort of where my love for electronics came from, or at least my sort of toleration of it, so that I could sort of tinker stuff and keep my brain happy, because I literally had nothing else to do, because it's not like we could afford a holiday. My dad was working so many hours and not earning anything, so we couldn't even go for a drive or whatever because he wasn't there half the time. But yeah, that sort of puts that into perspective. I had a pretty crazy childhood with not a lot of money, so learning to fix things, no matter how cheap or expensive, was how I got through. Otherwise, the other option was just to not have that thing anymore. As for whether we could run a business, well, I have thought about it, but we live in a rental property at the moment because, house prices are a thing. And I don't know if they would be particularly chuffed about a business running. especially since we live above a business, so they might be like, don't be doing that, our sort of rental property. I just think when it comes to repairing electronics and stuff like that, it's tough to make money on that. To actually keep it afloat as a business, the costs would be astronomical, and I would lose so much money every time there was a failed repair, because I have to invest lots of money in equipment to be able to, effectively do repairs properly, because electronics, like it or not, are very complex. Doesn't matter whether they're old or new, you're going to need diagnostic equipment. And you've got all that upfront cost to invest in that equipment. And then there's insurance, because if I break someone's, £1,000 Blaupunkt radio or whatever, what do I do? That's money out of my pocket, and that's a lot of money, even still at this point, that would still cost us a lot of money. And it's stuff like that that really kind of scares me off. It's why whenever I do any radio repairs, I normally do it as a kind of impartial, I'll let people know, this may or may not work, etc., etc. So, don't rely on this as gospel, and if anything happens, please be nice about it. Because at the end of the day, stuff's old, stuff's fragile, I am human, I make mistakes. A lot of the stuff was assembled by the machines later on as well, so taking it apart as a human can be pretty difficult. It scares me a little bit. I don't feel like I'd be confident running a business properly. I feel like it would be a lot of responsibility that I would struggle to manage. Maybe one day, I suppose never say never, maybe one day I'll find the right manager to help me sort of, manage something like that or whatnot. But for now, I'm comfortable not having the stress, if I'm honest. But thank you for the question, though. Is it true that reversing the polarity on speakers is akin to crossing the streams Ghostbusters style? Now, first of all, the Ghostbusters film is fantastic. Loved it, grew up with it, even as someone born in, the late 90s. My parents, were still watching 80s movies and whatnot on VHS. The Blues Brothers, for example, the 1980 Blues Brothers, one of my favourite films of all times. But interestingly, there's a bit of nuance when it comes to crossing the streams or reversing the polarity. If you have, say, an old car, like a 1950s car, a 1960s car, I suppose even some 70s cars, where they've got just a single speaker in the dash, if you reverse the polarity on that, there's a chance you might not even be able to tell. Because, yes, the speaker may pump inward first instead of outward, but it's still creating the same sound. And because our brains are dumb, hearing just one speaker work inverted, we're probably not even going to be able to tell. However, that changes massively when two speakers are involved. And I would say that maybe it is a little bit more akin to crossing the streams. Not necessarily because stuff will blow up like it will if you cross the streams in Ghostbusters, but because you will hear possibly one of the most horrible audio experiences you've ever heard. If you're in a car and you've got the speaker on this side wired normally, and then the speaker on that side wired weird, you'll end up with something called a phase cancellation. And what that happens is the two speakers actually fight against the air pressure. And this is actually how noise cancellation works in headphones. They have microphones that are on sort of the outside, and they listen to the outside world, and they pipe it in inversely to cancel out as much of the audio as they can. At least that's sort of to my understanding. I might be simplifying that a little bit. I'm sure I'm being corrected in the comments as we speak. But when the two speakers do that, it puts this horrible pressure on your head, or at least it does to me, and you can't really tell where the sound is. And I think it's an actual human trait that if you can't work out where sound's coming from when it's all around you, it can make you feel a bit disoriented. It ruins bass. I think it can even ruin treble. It's not good. Don't do it. Always make sure that the plus and minus coming out of your amplifier are wired the same. There's a reason that they make them plus and minus. It is because the speaker works best when it is wired best, and obviously needs to be matched all the way around your setup, otherwise it's just going to sound horrible. You won't do any damage doing that, wiring one backwards or one not, but you'll want to undo it immediately the moment you listen to it. If you're ever wondering as well what the polarity of your speaker is, you can actually do a little battery test where you can hook a battery up to a speaker, and if it pops outwards, congratulations, the plus and minus on the battery are currently connected to the plus and minus on the speaker. However, if the speaker pulls inwards, it means that the minus terminal on the battery is connected to the positive terminal on the speaker. So if you flip the battery around and find it pops out, congratulations, you can now mark the new plus and minus. So that's a really quick way of doing it. You can use a 1.5 volt AA or AAA battery. That's the safest, especially if you've got like a vintage paper cone speaker where they're not particularly high output. That guarantees that you won't like blow the thing to smithereens, because they can burn really quickly. Like, in order to do this test, you need to hold it on there for like a matter of seconds, literally just enough to observe which way it moves. Because if you hold it for longer than that, you can actually burn the coil out. You'll often see people recommend 9 volt batteries as well. And while I have done that, you need to be super careful with 9 volt batteries, because they definitely have the power to ruin speakers. Normally larger speakers can deal with it, but what I would say is try with a fully charged 1.5 volt battery first, and if you can observe speaker movement there, that's it, done. That's all you need to do. If it doesn't move at all and you know for a fact the battery's charged, say you've checked with a multimeter or something, then try a 9 volt battery. But literally touch it to it briefly, like this, literally this quickly. You just need to be able to see how much it moves. Any longer than that and you may genuinely blow things up. But yeah, that's one way you can check speaker polarity on speakers that don't mark them, because there are some out there, especially factory speakers or just some weird aftermarket ones sometimes don't mention it, especially if you've lost the documentation. Another way to check is normally one terminal's larger than the other, but I have seen some brands mix that up, so that's not always a guarantee either. But the battery is a guarantee. That does work as a way to definitively test what the polarity of your speaker is. I always say it saves a headache for everybody to just follow the manufacturer guidelines. You know, if an amplifier says this wire is positive and this wire is negative, and then the speaker says this wire is negative and this wire is positive, connect them up as they're designed. It prevents so many headaches, and if you don't, me and the Stay Puffed Marshmallow Man will come and find you when you cross those streams. But thank you for those questions. Hopefully I didn't look too dry while I was answering that. I mean, a lot of this takes quite a bit of my brain power, because although I am invested in audio, as I said in the beginning of the video, it's an absolute minefield of like false information, myths, audiophiles, like I say, literally making up said myths a lot of the time, like, oh, you need to make sure that your wires are suspended and all that. What? Like, what is that? But hopefully you learned something, and if you weren't able to learn something, hopefully the video was at least entertaining. And I apologise if you weren't able to learn things. It's best to just go out there and do research. Like I say, there's probably channels that will explain audio engineering way better than I ever could. If you want to sort of start at a basic level, start looking at like What Hi-Fi magazine, which I think goes by to like decades ago. I bet somewhere in a What Hi-Fi magazine issue they've probably got an explanation on like how audio works. So I'd recommend sort of looking up something like that. But anyway, thanks for watching the video. Like I say, hopefully it's not too rambly. I know by saying that I am in fact rambling right now, but yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.